It's another morning. Good morning and welcome to 55 minutes of current and relevant business conversations. That's what we do on Business Morning. I'm Ini John Mekwa, and we would normally and would do today start the business from the global space where oil prices edged up on Tuesday on a potential breakdown in talks between the U.S. and Iran over Tehran's nuclear program and the weakened prospect of more Iranian oil supplies entering into the global market. So for this morning, we see a drop in Brent, 0.78%, and that brings it to $65.03 a barrel. WTI is also down 0.64% to $62.29 a barrel. That's the drivers. Obviously, Washington would require any new deal between the U.S. and Iran, and that would include agreement to refrain from enrichment, which is a precursor to the development of nuclear bombs. An agreement between the two sides would have paved the way for easing of U.S. sanctions and allowed Iran to raise its oil export by about 300,000 barrels, between 300 and 4,000 barrels a day. Additional pressure on oil prices was exerted by data showing decelerating industrial output growth and retail sales in China. Remember, China is the world's top oil importer. Prices could whipsaw in the near term on tariffs, U.S.-Iran talks, economic uncertainty, and the war between Russia and Ukraine. Back here in Nigeria, the Petroleum Products Retail Outlet Owners Association of Nigeria, that's Petron, they're demanding a realistic deadline for the completion of rehabilitation works on the country's refineries, particularly the new 210,000 barrels per day Port Harcourt refinery. In a statement released by the association, it expressed concern over the persistent delays despite numerous assurances from the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation Limited on the project's completion deadline, which have suffered repeated setbacks. Meanwhile, Petron says the new Port Harcourt refinery, when completed, will serve the whole systems comprising about 13 states in the country and reduce the cost of transporting petroleum products. The Minister of Communications, Innovation and Digital Economy, Mr. Bosun Tijani, says the sector has witnessed massive growth under President Bola Tinubu, attracting $191 million in foreign direct investment in the first quarter of 2024, a nine-fold increase from $22 million in 2023 of the same period. Mr. Tijani highlights the sector's robust workforce development driven by 3 million technical talent program. He also reveals plans for a $2 billion initiative to deploy 90,000 kilometers of fiber optic infrastructure nationwide starting from the fourth quarter of 2025. Regarding connectivity, Mr. Tijani announced that the project's bridge focused on deploying 90,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable will commence in the fourth quarter of this year. And to the market, Nigeria's capital market has been seen as key to achieving the nation's ambitious goal of attaining a $1 trillion economy by 2030. This is the belief of the Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, who was represented at the SEC CMC meeting in Lagos.
As Nigeria sets its sights on becoming a $1 trillion economy, the capital market is being positioned as a central engine driving that ambition. At the Capital Market Committee meeting in Lagos, the Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Mr. Wale Edu, represented by Minister of State for Finance, Dr. Doris Uzoka Anite, underscored the pivotal role of the capital market in achieving Nigeria's bold economic vision.
At the end of this CMC meeting, and that going forward, we leave here with that resolution or that commitment to deepen the market transparently, create a fair system, rule-based system that investors can predict. Because if there's no predictability, as they say, capital is a coward. We've done all the reforms. We'll keep on doing as much reforms as we can, but reform is one thing. Implementation of the reform is even more critical than bringing out the reform.
Director General of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Dr. Emomotimi Agama, took the stage to unveil what he called a transformative era for Nigeria's capital market.
I am pleased to inform you that the Commission has already constituted an implementation team tasked with a thorough and practical engagement with every provision of the Investment and Securities Act number 2, 2025. This act will not be like other acts. Every line and every letter of this act will be implemented. We will make sure that everyone that is here, and indeed the market, enjoys the benefits of this law.
Participants believe with renewed reforms, regulatory clarity, and growing investor trust, Nigeria's capital market is not just participating in the trillion-dollar dream, it's leading the charge.
And now today is a special day in Nigeria because it's the decision day for the Monetary Policy Committee meeting that started yesterday. We expect to get the full decision today, and as usual, during Business Incorporated, we'll give you the live coverage of it. So please do stay with us from 1 p.m. The studios will open until, and we'll have analysts discuss expectations and some considerations until the governor of the central bank is ready to make that announcement. So you can get it first here on Channels Television. Meanwhile, let's preempt, I guess, or some of the expectations, and we're doing that with the manager at Financial Derivatives Company, Dumebi Uduwole, right here in the studio. Hi, Dumebi. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Ine. Great to be here again.
Good. So today is decision day. I don't know, is there any dissenting voice that is going to be a whole decision?
Right now, I don't think there is. Markets do expect that. And the reason is very simple. We have a lot of factors that are driving the decision that the MPC is going to make today. So we do know that the exchange rate is a very big deal, a major consideration for the MPC. Growth numbers as well, inflation numbers primarily.
Inflation number is confusing these days.
So we do know the inflation trend as well, and of course what is happening globally, right? And let's start with what's happening globally and how that will influence the interest rate decision of the MPC. Globally, we've seen a lot of uncertainty around global markets, and that's significantly impacting the commodities market, which is very, very significant to Nigeria, both on the export level and on the import level. On the export side, we have seen that oil prices are significantly lower compared to what the federal government had put in the 2025 budget at $75 per barrel, and we're seeing oil prices currently trade at $65 per barrel, and there are chances that oil price could even fall further. Right? Projections from JP Morgan are also saying that as well. The IEA is also saying that OPEC is looking towards that as well, especially because of the increase that they are planning to put out there. So what that tells us is that the oil market is quite bearish, and the CBN has to obviously consider that because of the negative impact that would have on exchange rate expectations and investor sentiments, and how that will feed into the Naira, and obviously
sorry, I know you want to analyze other issues, but
yes.
Do you see a situation where the budget is tweaked because of something like the oil price? Because the difference is quite much.
Yes,
and
yes.
This is even an improvement that we see it at 65. We had at 50,
yes.
And with the OPEC Plus increased output, that will reduce the price even further.
Yeah.
Do we see a situation where the federal government goes back to, tweak the parameters in the budget?
Yeah, of course, it's not far-fetched. We have seen that happen before now. Supplementary budgets have been created because of revenue shortfalls. So it's not far-fetched to think that that would be the case. But right now, with the kind of momentum we are seeing from the federal government and CBN, we aren't obviously seeing that they will try to explore other options. We've seen a lot of talks around non-oil export revenue, around taxation. Even the World Bank in its development report hinted at the fact that the tariffs and the importation bans and the increase in custom duties and all of that, while they might look like huge revenue generation sources at the moment, in short term, they are currently triggering inflationary pressures right now for Nigeria. So there's also the flip side of the alternative revenue sources that the federal government is exploring. And I think that there might be other conversations around debt or raising a Eurobond, another Eurobond issuance.
Yeah, I think I
or
heard something like that.
a domestic dollar bond issuance like we saw at the end of 2024. And because of investor appetite towards Nigerian economy, to an extent right now, we do think that that might be a successful one to an extent. But obviously, the decline in oil prices, the recent declining trend of FPI inflows just raise question marks on how successful that will be. But remember, the people that will be subscribing to this are more long-term investors, right? So there is the prospect that they will be, that their appetite might still be quite, fresh towards such revenue generation sources for the federal government. And the reason why I'm saying that this is a huge possibility is because deficit monetizing from the central bank will be very, very slim. The central bank has, reinstated over time the reason why they're going to remain orthodox, and such moves like ways and means advancing or deficit financing or deficit monetization will be very slim. The prospects of that happening will be very, very slim. The CBN really has done its house cleaning. We've seen net reserves significantly increase and all of that. So we don't think that that would be the case. So instead, the federal government might want to adopt more, first of all, domestic, domestic borrowing.
But I mean, the target for the fixed income market for this quarter is lower than we expected, actually.
Yes, I mean, it's not, again, like I said, it's not too far-fetched. There will be obviously some level of market, restructuring or market moves from the CBN to encourage that aspect. But again, like I mentioned, the resources available, the options available, either we have to do a Eurobond issuance to raise that revenue, or we do a domestic dollar bond issuance again. And this will be happening side by side. Bilateral conversations. We've seen the AFDB come to the table. The federal government is also in talks with the World Bank, but not exactly for a full-blown loan, because Nigeria wants to somewhat maintain that non-debt status with the IMF and to an extent with the World Bank as well. So syndicated loans, bilateral loans are things that we believe the government might want to adopt in the meantime.
Yeah, but especially even the domestic, even though it's cheaper, but it still increases our debt servicing, and that is a continental problem now, debt servicing.
I mean, yes, it is. But remember, it's not just a Nigeria problem now. But speaking on what is happening with Nigeria, debt servicing in itself, yes, it is. But we have also seen some moves towards reducing the FX overhead on that regard. So if you're paying in Naira, if you're borrowing in Naira, the chances of so much pressure being on the currency is slimmer, right? So what that means is that the pressure on the central bank, the pressure on the FX markets, the pressure on exchange rate expectations, inflation expectations, all of that, and even sovereign credit ratings will somewhat minimize. And remember, that's why I said it's going to be side by side. It wouldn't be just straight up domestic borrowing that we will see, right? Again, the government is going to try to balance it, and that's what we've seen based off of the trends that we have seen from 2024, even going into 2025, and what the CBN also has in its playbook.
So we have other factors, especially from the global space, feeding into, I don't know how much impact, although we've seen it already, the talks between Iran and the US.
Yes.
That has broken down, at least for now, and we've seen the impact on oil. US and China, they have 90 days. I wonder if we should, because we've seen China try to make some moves. The China ambassador met with our Minister of Solid Minerals, trying to make some moves within this 90 days, so that whatever happens, whatever President Trump feels like at the end of the 90 days, but I wonder how all of this will feed into our commodity and the value of our currency.
I mean, it's pretty direct in the sense that Nigeria is highly exposed to changes in the oil markets. And from everything you've mentioned so far, what that just tells us is volatility, right? So even though oil prices go down or they go up, the fact that we're seeing sharp swings in that commodity price, what that tells us is that there's going to be high volatility. And whether or not it seems in our favor or not, the goal has to be for us to look inwards to try to hedge against that. And what that looks like in practice is a significant increase in our oil production. Now is the time for us to leverage more on the volume of production, because when you look at economies of scale, there are ways for businesses or even countries now to balance things out commodity-wise. You can either leverage on a very high price, and whether you produce so much or not, you're able to still break even. or you can leverage on high volume to sell to multiple markets.
Yeah, well, good enough.
So
Our last production went up.
Exactly.
But
so when
we are
you
not
look at,
on
but
2
we're
million
not
yet.
just there yet. So
exactly.
when you see what we need to break even, what that tells us is that because oil is still a very significant commodity for Nigeria's earnings, what that tells us that we need to ramp up production as much and sell to a diversified market. So if selling to only China, just giving an example now, is what we have been doing before, we have to look to selling to other markets, look to selling to India. If we've been selling only to European markets, we also have to look to selling to other more European markets, also sell to other, you know, countries
Outside
that will, yes,
Europe.
so outside what we have been doing before. So that's on the oil production side. There's also the conversation that we've been having for decades long.
Diversification, I'm sure.
Of course, and the reason is because we cannot stop talking about it. Now, Nigeria is very blessed in terms of resources. I don't think we can emphasize that enough. But a model that we have seen worked in advanced markets and even emerging markets like China is the ownership of state governments towards the resources that they do own comparative advantage in. A lot of times we do wait for the center, and that's why we have seen the heavy reliance on FACT disbursements. But when state governments begin to take responsibility for the resources that they have to encourage investments into that, we will see the increase in a lot of production for these commodities.
But some state governments will talk about the exclusive lists. That is also a hurdle if you talk to a whole lot of state governments. If you talk about solid minerals, for instance, I mean, businesses and individuals have to go to the center to get licenses to manage the resources that is in states. You know, so these are some of the hurdles that they have brought up, you know, that's stopping them from exploring the avenue that is abundant, you know, in resources and funding.
And I do think that, I know the last time when I came, I know I mentioned a lot about building that government trust and ensuring that we have these kinds of conversations, because the goal is not for us to remain where we are. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And so we have seen what it has been. We have seen the result of the center managing the resources of the entire nation. And that's why we are where we are today. So expecting a different result from that same model is just insanity. So what we need to do is change that model. And we do have templates that have succeeded in this. Malaysia is a template. Taiwan is a template. Singapore is a template. China is a template. Japan is a template.
I think that's where politics comes in, because we've been holding constitutional amendment. We have been holding town hall meetings and all of it. We're talking about having regions, empowering regions and subnationals. But who will let the power go? Who wants to control less territory and resources? I mean, who's ready to sacrifice that? I guess that's why we seem stuck. Even though we know what we want, we say what we want, but we cannot see what we want.
I mean, you're not wrong in that regard. Economic theory always tells us the strong interdependence and correlation and interconnectedness between the political economy and the macroeconomy. And we cannot isolate that. So I think, like the last time I know we had this conversation, and I did mention that it's extremely important to have the learned ones in places of power. It's extremely important that we have people that can execute and do the right thing for people. Remember, the people we have in authority are not supposed to be there of their own bidding, right? It's an office of service. And service to not just themselves, but service to the people. And so anything that is outside of that, what that means is that the people obviously have to be able to question all of this. Remember, the people in the places of authority are not there of their own bidding. We put them there. And we have to make sure that that they are accountable for everything that they do.
They're supposed to be voted there.
Exactly.
So they're supposed to remember those who voted them there.
Exactly.
Okay. All right, maybe. So all of this is to say there's going to be a hold, most likely a hold from the MPC. What does that translate to the micro or
micro
economy?
level?
What does it translate?
Primarily, that looks like would go into interest rates. So first of all, look at the interest rates transmission mechanism from the monetary policy rate to the interest rates that banks would, give to business owners. So looking at the lending rate. So what that tells us is that lending rates will still remain as high as they have. And what that tells us when you break it down again is that it would affect the prices of commodities, because if business owners are still getting very high interest rates. It means that their ability to scale, the ability to employ as much people would also be slim, and the ability to produce is somewhat not capped, but it just means that the cost of their production is higher, and that will feed into prices, because oftentimes in situations like this, we do see business owners transfer the burden of their cost to consumers through higher prices. Then there's also the aspect of primarily through interest rates, that's what we're going to see. But then again, we also know that from the commodities market space, we're also seeing that there are other factors affecting, commodity prices, right? So apart from the selling price, which is the interest rate transmission mechanism, there are other factors. So for instance, seasonality right now is one of the big factors that we are seeing impact the commodities market space. Commodities like tomatoes, and their prices are really going high now because it's the planting season for those commodities. Then on the import side, you have that with the tariffs that we have, the import bans that we have, and the higher global commodity prices, it means that importation cost is also high, and that is affecting, commodity prices.
Yeah, I really wish that one day we'll be talking about domestic commodities and not talk about season.
Yes,
we have, as a country, we do have the ability to have these crops all year round. If there's attention given to storage, value chain development, and all of that. We don't need to say, oh, this season there's going to be cheaper tomatoes, and then next season. And I really wish that one day we'll get out of this cycle. That would be an exciting one.
Yes, I mean, we all look forward to it because we do know what needs to be done, ensuring that we do have those storage facilities, there's farm-to-market access, the farmers are equipped enough to, move goods and services freely and cheaper, affordable. Okay, but basically, I believe we all get the point.
Yeah, but the issue of security is still there. Just yesterday, Benue still had that attack. We're not done with the series that we had less than a month ago. Now we have, it seems like, another one, and Benue is the food basket. So of course this is going to affect.
It's going to definitely be a very big issue.
At the end of the day, we saw inflation. I don't know if you looked at inflation from Benue State. The food inflation there, I think, was over 100%.
Yes,
and
significantly high.
Yeah, and this is where we're supposed to be having cheaper food
coming from, and you're very right about that. I think with the food security issue in Nigeria, I think the biggest question mark right now is insecurity and tackling it. And until we see significant improvements in insecurity, targeted to especially the major food producing states in Nigeria, which are residents in the north, we will continually have these kinds of conversations. But I mean, one other thing to just kind of notice, we're also seeing small scale businesses kind of try to solve like the smaller issues, small but big issues that are contributing to the food security, food insecurity challenge that Nigeria is currently facing today, from cold storage to logistics, to value addition. We are seeing small businesses move in that regard to, find those niche problems and to solve them. So I think another thing to also do is support those businesses as much as possible, ensuring that they're able to scale and do a lot more. And I think another thing to do, just still leveraging that state template I mentioned, kind of supporting other states that do have some of these, commodities, ensuring that they're able to produce as much and supporting them with the right storage facilities and farm-to-market access.
Yeah, well, we do hope there'll be that intentionality.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Because we've heard it, we've seen the paper and the policies and all of that, but that implementation. But thank you so much, Dumebi, for your time and perspective this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. All right, let's take a break. It's MPC Decision Day. You get the decision when the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria announces that that'll be during Business Incorporated later on 1 p.m. today, and Ladi will be there. So we'll see if Dumebi is right with our hold expectations. Well, she's not alone. I mean, almost all the economists I've spoken to expect there to be a hold decision by the MPC, looking at the parameters and the macro, micro, and global parameters that are playing out at this time. But let's take a break now here on Business Morning. We'll be back with another conversation. To stay with us.
It's not.
welcome back to watching Business Morning right here on Channels Television, where I was just talking with maybe about options available to the government amidst lowering revenue through crude. And I had a conversation earlier, well, that was last week at the Africa CEO Forum with the global head of strategy, S&P Global. And I know once you hear S&P Global, what you would hear is rating. Well, we had the conversation more than rating this time around, talking about developing Africa's domestic market. So imagine that the government needs to borrow. And you don't have to go to the multinationals, but you can actually do the African market to borrow. That was the conversation that I had there with Mr. Tunde Akindele on the opportunities that are available and why it does seem like on the continent, the domestic market is not well developed, or is it the issue of capacity that's the problem? Well, we're going to have that interview in a bit, but I do think we need to take a short break, and then we'll be back to give you that conversation that I had with Mr. Tunde Akindele at the just concluded Africa CEO Forum in Abidjan. Just before that conversation, still talking about Africa empowering itself and depending more on each other, is the issue of easing trade within the continent. That's what Nigeria's aviation minister hopes to achieve. And they had a meeting, an elaborate meeting and conversation on that yesterday. And here is the highlight of that.
Nigeria is hosting the 18th Banjo Group plenary meeting, and representatives from member states such as Cabo Verde, the Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone are all present in Abuja. The Banjo Group was set up in January 2004 to harmonize civil aviation policies and promote international aviation cooperation among member states. The host, as well as other participants, believe this essence has not been defeated.
Nigeria, with a deep sense of pride, gladly hosts this 18th plenary, which further serves as an opportunity to not only reflect on our collective achievements, but also renew our focus on the challenges ahead. Challenges that stem from infrastructure gaps and personal shortages to emerging safety risk and an imperative of digital transformation in aviation.
It is gratifying to note that as a group, we have been able to further the dreams and aspirations of the founding fathers. However, our existence as a group and its agencies is under threat by serious funding challenges, which we must address as member states.
The National Assembly is not left out as it looks beyond the challenges.
From a legislative perspective, we will focus on the following. A, enhanced regulatory frameworks for safety and security. B, improved safety oversight and compliance with ICAO standards and best practices.
Nigeria's Minister of Aviation and Aerospace Development canvasses for the adoption of a single African air transport market.
I want to highlight the urgent need to implement the single air transport market, otherwise known as SATAM, for the benefit of our sub-region and the entire African continent. Achieving this requires our collective resolve not only to implement SATAM, but also to make conscious efforts to address the issues of non-fiscal barriers, including the high cost of travel within the region.
Mr. Keyamo believes the adoption of the policy by member states will enhance intra-Africa connectivity and reduce transit points for passengers. Kumbi Apoluade, Channels Television News.
That's it, working towards enhancing closer trade or trade relations within the African continent. We'll certainly bring you that conversation in a bit. But now let's look at what's going on in the global space with Will Ebong. Will has gathered some stories, obviously connected to trade and what's going on from global outside Africa. Will Ebong comes in now.
And it is elaborate welcome you gave to me now this morning. I'm wondering now. I had to be saying, oh, wow, I'm a great personality.
Yes, you are.
But seriously, we have a lot of trade, talks going on. We have Vietnam and US, entering another round of talks. But we're going to kick off with Australia. That's, rate cuts. Interest rates is what is, the in thing, especially right today. We are waiting for decision.
Do you see an interest rate cut in Nigeria?
Well,
next year.
Maybe not. I don't know. It's maybe a hold stance for me. That's my own. But I don't know. Let's see what the CBN says about it. But Australia's central bank has lowered its benchmark interest rate to 3.85%, its second cut this year and the lowest in 2 years as inflation continues to ease. Now, the Reserve Bank says inflation rates are more balanced, but global economic uncertainty could slow growth. It expects inflation to fall to 3% by year end with no commitment yet to further rate cuts. Despite weaker global trends, the RBA still sees moderate growth ahead, but has trimmed its 2025 GDP forecast to 2.1%, warning that trade tensions remain a key risk. Now, also in the interest rate market, China has cut its benchmark lending rates for the first time since October, aiming to boost credit and consumer demand amid slowing growth and ongoing trade tensions with the U.S. The one-year loan prime rate was lowered to 3% and the 5-year to 3.5%. Now, major state banks also trimmed deposit rates, encouraging more lending across the economy. Analysts say the modest cuts show policymakers are cautious even as they seek to stabilize growth. Now, the move follows a 90-day pause in U.S.-China tariffs, but with weak lending and a stagnant housing market, some economists warn that China may still need a larger stimulus to meet its 5% growth target. Now, say in Asia, Indonesia forecasts economic growth of at least 5.2% in 2026, focusing on food security, energy, and welfare. Finance Minister Sri Mulyani says the government will maintain purchasing power and boost investment in key sectors. The 2026 budget plans more spending on health, education, and defense, including free meals for students and pregnant women, and modernizing military equipment. But some analysts are skeptical, saying the welfare focus lacks bold reforms. They argue Indonesia needs deeper investment to drive stronger long-term growth. Now, Japan's 7&I holding is in talks with sell around 10% of its stake in 7 bank to trading giant Itochu, with a deal announcement expected by May the 30th, according to Nikkei. The stake, worth about 30 billion yen, that's about $208 million, is currently held by supermarket arms Ito Yokado and York Benimaru. News of the talks sent 7 bank shares up nearly 10%. The move aligns with 7&I's strategy to refocus on its core convenience store business as it weighs a takeover proposal from Canada's Alimentation Couche-Tard. Now, the U.S. and Vietnam have started a second round of trade talks in Washington to avoid a looming 46% tariff threatening Vietnam's export-driven economy. The talks run through May 22, led by Vietnam's Trade Minister Nguyen Hong Dien, with officials from key sectors. The U.S. has delayed the higher tariff until July, currently applying a 10% rate. Vietnam, with a $123 billion trade surplus last year, aims to protect its role as a major manufacturing hub. Now, U.S. Treasury yields slipped after the Fed signaled just one rate cut in 2025. The 10-year yield dipped to 4.45%, while the 30-year eased after briefly topping 5%. Now, this comes as Moody's downgraded the U.S. credit rating, though analysts say market impact will be limited. Fed official Raphael Bostic also backed just one cut this year, citing inflation concerns and the effects of recent tariffs. Now, yesterday we saw solar stocks taking a hit after reports that key U.S. clean energy tax will be rolled to be ended earlier than expected, with lawmakers pushing for these cuts these subsidies to be removed, the future of America's green energy transition is uncertain. Now, to help us unpack the implications for the market and policy, we are joined by Dr. Ted George, the Chief Narrative Officer, Cleos Advisory Limited. Good morning, Dr. George. It's good to have you on the program. Oh, we've seen solar stocks taking a dive, took a sharp hit yesterday with some major players dropping between 3 and 8%. And from your perspective as an expert, is this just a short-term market reaction, a knee-jerk reaction as a result of this news of a subsidy removal, or is it deeper concern about the future of solar energy in the U.S.?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the drop in the solar tech stocks yesterday was a reaction to this announcement, or at least by efforts by the Republican administration to put a bill into Congress which will stop a lot of the provisions of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. And one of those was a 30% solar tax credit for homeowners. And so obviously that will massively undercut demand for solar. That's why we've seen this immediate drop in the price of tech stocks. But I think going forward as well for solar and as well for other kinds of renewable energy like wind power, there is a big question mark as well. Because the thing is, with all kinds of new technologies which are renewable, they require a period of subsidies or protection until they can become competitive with fossil fuels. You could argue that solar's pretty much there at the moment, but of course we now have a weak oil price, which means the competition is much sharper from oil and gas at the moment. So a lot of people are hoping this isn't the thin end of the wedge, but in America it's complicated. It's never just one simple picture here. Some people are in favor of solar, some are against, and I think we'll see that division going forward.
So, but how critical are these tax credits, these subsidies for these companies right now? And what will happen to the industry, to the clean energy industry, the renewable energy industry, if they're cut back earlier than expected? And would they be able to, would they still have the capacity to compete with traditional fossil fuel energy companies?
Well, this is the real problem. I mean, essentially, you need subsidies so that certain technologies can go through that period of research and development and greatly increase in efficiency. You might remember yourself in West Africa, if you go back maybe 20 years, the first generation of solar panels were pretty poor. They didn't work very well. They were very difficult to install. They broke down, and ultimately they got a bad reputation. The next generation now, if you're buying solar panels for your home, they're incredibly resilient. They have smart meters inside to get the best use of your power. And in fact, you can buy them on credit, for as little as, $1 or $2 a day. So the truth is that probably in the case of solar power, it doesn't need the same kind of subsidies. But the big issue here in the US is these subsidies were for home owners. You can imagine Americans spend a huge amount of money on their homes. And if you know you're getting a 30% tax break for going for solar, you might as well if you're moving into a new property. Now that's taken away. That could hugely undercut demand in the USA. That's the big concern. But my own view would be, I think the real worry here is oil prices. You've only got to go back 2 or 3 years. They were over $120 a barrel. Even at the start of this year, they were around $80 a barrel. We're now down to about 65. That's making it really difficult for solar and wind to compete. Whereas before, when oil was much higher, they actually came in much cheaper. So I think the real concern here is if we see countries like Saudi Arabia massively increasing oil in order to drive down prices, it's going to make the squeeze even tighter on solar energy.
So I'm looking at the picture here and I'm wondering how Africa fits into all of this, how they navigate this, especially with the fact that, energy sufficiency, we have a huge energy gap, lacking in Africa. And now that we're seeing prices of oil getting cheaper and solar being cheaper, and the fact that even if oil is cheaper, electricity remains a huge problem. But looking at the big picture for the U.S. administration and the fact that we still depend on the dollar, is this a bigger shift from the clean energy narrative that we've been seeing or hearing for the past few years?
Yes, unfortunately so. I mean, I think the Trump administration and their many supporters have made it very clear that they consider clean energy to be the big con, the big scam. They're trying to cut back all kinds of subsidies and all kinds of investment and drill, baby, drill. Bring out more oil, more coal and more gas. It's a disastrous approach. It runs in the face of all of the available evidence of not only global warming, but extreme weather events battering the USA. Even the states who are saying it doesn't exist, and they're getting tornadoes, fires and flooding, which are causing mass destruction. And the thing is, politically, it's a kind of a difficult one for Trump, because the second state with the most solar panels of anywhere in the US is Texas, which is a red state. But I think the important thing to understand here is even though at a federal level the government might stop supporting things like solar, at a state level it's very different. California and New York are very liberal states. They have some of the strictest green regulation there is there, and they are pushing very hard for solar power. And so I think this fracture that we see in politics in the States, we're going to see again when it comes to renewable energy, with the blue, more liberal states pushing ahead, perhaps even becoming more radical in their moves to net zero, while some of the red states are just going to try and pretend that it's not happening and start focusing again on fossil fuels.
We'll definitely keep an eye on this development and see where it takes us. Dr. Ted George, Chief Narrative Officer, Cleos Advisory Limited. Thank you so much for joining us on Business Morning today.
My pleasure.
Any drill, baby drill, that's what's happening. I think we're just going to be moving from solar energy right now to oil, because if solar becomes more expensive than fossil fuel, I don't think this clean, renewable energy transition thing is going to work anytime soon.
Yeah, and you see, that's why there are conversations as to, for Africa, let's grow at our pace. So sometimes you want to meet up with the Western world. The Western world have explored a lot of their fossil fuel.
True.
You know, but for a continent like ours, we still have huge untapped
deposits of, of
fossil fuel. And yes, we also have the resources for renewable energy and all of that. And yes, it might be very capital intensive, especially at the initial stage. But I mean, if we find a balance on the continent, I believe we'll be fine and not compete
with the rest of the world.
Exactly.
Finding something that works for us, perhaps using the deposit, the money gotten from the fossil fuels to be able to balance and grow the infrastructure for the solar energy. And so we have diversified energy sources and not depend on just one source of energy.
Well, we'll keep talking about it, Will.
We will.
Thank you so much. All right, now that's our promised conversation that I had talking about Africa looking inwards. Of course, the issue of rating does come in, but can the continent develop its domestic debt market to serve its purpose? That's the conversation I had with the head of strategy at S&P Global.
Ratings are forward-looking opinions about the creditworthiness of an entity, and it boils down to the ability or the willingness, the capacity or willingness of that entity to meet its financial commitments as they come due. Right, and ratings are really relative ranking of creditworthiness depending on which sector. So that's primarily what ratings are. And for me, really, for S&P Global Ratings, we rate a lot of entities in Africa. We rate entities in Nigeria as well, and we rate sovereigns as well. And it's important for us that seeing Africa as a continent, Nigeria as a country, we believe in the growth potential of the region, the growth potential of the country, and the interest really is to understand how we can deepen our engagement in the country, our engagement across the continent. Specifically, how can we help to deepen the debt capital markets, both the cross-border market and the domestic debt capital markets across Africa?
So how would you describe the activities that we have? I mean, we have renewed activities in Nigeria's debt market. How would you describe it?
I acknowledge what you said, right? More activities in recent times, especially from the debt capital market in Nigeria. But if I were to look, just generally looking at it relative to other countries in Africa and the potential that we see, I'll say there's still a lot of potential to be tapped into. Yes, it's a good thing that there are activities. And why do I say that? If I take an example of South Africa, where the debt, the size of the corporate bond market compared to the GDP is north of 40%, right? And when I look at Nigeria as an example, you're looking at about 2.5% of GDP, which tells me that there are a lot of opportunities to do more right? And that's why for us, we see a lot of the reform activities and the activities in the debt capital market, and we think there are opportunities to partner up, help in educating more stakeholders, working with bilateral institutions to see how we can help increase that knowledge, help increase the research available to then help increase the activities in the debt capital market, especially in the domestic bond market.
When you talk about a more active domestic market, where does it come from? Who's supposed to drive it?
When it comes to the bond market, it really ranges, right? The key stakeholders, and it goes from institutional investors, the government as well. At the end of the day, when we talk about the domestic bond market, what we're talking about is entities being able to raise funds from folks who are resident within that country, entities, corporations, pension funds within that country. And what it means is really you're raising a bond, and it could be government raising the bond, it could be an entity. I think some of the Nigerian entities, Dangote as an example, would raise some bonds domestically, they will raise some in cross-border markets. And the goal is really to fund projects within the country. So all stakeholders are involved, right? If it's government raising a bond, they can sell to institutional investors who hold these bonds with the promise of a coupon rate that they get on it. Pension funds will probably tap into that as well to turn over the pension of people. So everyone benefits, right? The purpose for which the fund is raised, we don't advise on that. We don't make recommendations on that, because at the end of the day, the investors will look at those projects, look at the feasibility of the project. They will take the credit rating as one of the factors that they consider, and then look at the entities raising the fund and their credibility as well, which is reflected in the credit rating to an extent, and use that to determine if they should. Now, the essence of having more participation is that there will be more projects, right? When you think about all the projects based on the reform that the government is trying to implement, infrastructure projects, so many other things out there, is the ability to raise funds from the local market, to invest in the local market. One of the things you see, of course, is the fact that there's a lot of activity in cross-border where we want to go into a different market, the international market, to raise funds. And that is fine, but there are also ways where we can raise funds domestically to invest in things that people can see, and that can help to develop the domestic bond market, which also says that when you think about issuers, right, folks that are issuing these bonds, there are requirements and high bars for going to the cross-border bond market. But when you are raising funds in the domestic market, it's not as strict or as stringent as when you're going to the cross-border market. So when you think about medium-sized corporations as an example, it's easier to raise money in the domestic market. And then after a while, you can graduate to the cross-border market. So those are some of the dynamics to think about. But at the end of the day, the decisions about what projects to fund will be based on the issuer's strategy and what they communicate to the market.
And we're still celebrating Nigeria's first dollar-euro bond. I mean, I guess that's what you would call domestic but cross-border, since it was targeted at Nigerians in diaspora.
It's a little bit of cross-border, because yes, they're targeting Nigerians in the diaspora, but those Nigerians are outside that country itself, and it's euro denominated as an example. That makes it a cross-border bond, and even though they targeted, or their primary targets are Nigerians, I'm sure there are other investment firms that participated in it, so that would be a cross-border bond. But if the Nigerian government or a corporation says we're going to raise funds in the domestic bond market, which will be Naira denominated as an example, that's a domestic business, right? The thing, though, is while there are two different markets, there's a lot of cross-pollination by entities depending on the project they want to fund. So if you're funding a refinery project, as an example, you might decide to go to the cross-border market, right? But if you're funding a project that is localized in the country and it's all driven by things going in the country, you may decide based on the perception of the issuer about cost of capital and other factors, decide to issue locally.
And while we're on the topic of Africa depending on itself and winning itself of, foreign aids and funding, are there instruments that are, particularly African targeted, just debt instrument for Africa, maybe between countries?
I can't opine on specific instruments being issued out there. I can say just from public knowledge, I'm aware there are some MLIs like Afrexim and Co. working on instruments, talking about instruments within Africa, but it's not something that we actively participate in as a rating agency. However, we do have a cross-functional research arm that focuses on research on instruments in Africa, trends, and risk factors as well. So that may be an opportunity to look at that side and say, okay, what's going on in there? But I know there are conversations, anecdotal conversations around that.
And so talking about Africa looking inwards, do countries on the continent have the capacity? Can Africa really do without foreign funding or aids, just depending on each other?
I mean, I won't necessarily comment on the capacity of individual countries. And for us at S&P Global, we welcome cross-border. That's primarily what we do, and we're active across the continent right now on that. We also welcome inward funding as well. And I think the capacity generally is always there because at the end of the day, we're talking about sourcing funds from people who trust you the most, right? And when it comes to that, there are always available funds where there is a need to invest them. Think about funds in the insurance space, in the pension space. That's excess capacity that needs to be invested, right? The question is, does it get invested, right? And I think to the extent that corporations, entities, sovereigns within the continent are willing to make some of those available, there's enough data and transparency of data, there is definitely funds available. Because when you think about the fund flow outside of Africa to foreign denominated bonds and all that, there is reasonable traction, which tells you that there is funding available. It is now a function of issuers tapping into that, right? And it varies per country, it varies per topics as well.
Well, that was it. Africa looking for ways to develop its debt market and not rely so much on, players outside the continent. We hope that they come. So it's just before we let you go off the program, yesterday we saw that Nigeria's stock market closed slightly down, really minimal, but we hope it doesn't build on that today at 0.01%. That's where it closed, even though it's still around 109,000, and the market cap is almost 69 trillion, but not there yet. 68.9 trillion is what we closed with yesterday. Today is MPC Day, MPC Decision Day. The meeting started yesterday, and that's what we'll be doing mostly during Business Incorporated. Ladi will be here with Will Ebong to take you around that, and of course we'll give you live feed from the announcement at the headquarters of the Central Bank of Nigeria. That'll be at 1 p.m., so you don't want to miss it. I'm Ini John Mekwa, wishing you a beautiful and a profitable day. Bye-bye.